One of the most consistent instructions in basketball is the importance of a very low defensive stance when playing defense. This is something that I learned from my first year playing, and every coach I've ever played for really emphasized the need to get in a really low, really wide stance. Now, what low means was never really explained so much. I do remember at basketball camps when I was young, we'd sit in a stance, the coach would yell out defense or whatever, and we'd have to slap the floor, and we'd stand in a defensive stance. And inevitably, the coach would walk around and tell us to get lower and lower and lower and lower. And then they'd start pushing shoulders, which I talked about in an earlier issue or episode. And if we moved at all, then they would encourage us to get a even wider stance and even lower stance. So low stance is something that's viewed as important and valued, even though it's fairly unspecified. Why a low stance is important is also rarely explained. So again, I spoke about a little bit in another episode about the reason why I would use a low wide stance to discourage a drive. But the assumption that I hear from a lot of coaches is that in a low stance you move quicker. And there is a certain element of truth to that, but it's not wholly truthful. So this weekend I participated in some fitness testing for refereeing, for soccer refereeing, and two of the tests incorporated 10-meter lateral shuffles, which truthfully is longer than you would really ever shuffle in a basketball game. If you're shuffling that long, you're either exceptionally quick, or you're going to get beat. So, take it with a grain of salt. It's not entirely what a basketball player would do. But nobody in these testings got into a really low stance. Everybody, when they're shuffling laterally, was fairly erect. There's a little bit of bend in the knees, a little bit of bend in the hips, but generally speaking, a more or less erect stance, trying to move as fast as possible. And that is how you move quicker. So, sprinters do not flex, maximum flex at the hip and knee when they run. They run tall. They're not in a, kind of a squatting stance. It's just not a stance that people move quickly in. It's not a natural stance. And so I saw that repeatedly, every single person. Nobody started their lateral shuffling in a low stance, and nobody moved in this low stance. Now, the one time where a stance got lower is when we changed directions. So if we shuffled to our left for 10 meters and we had to shuffle back to our right, that last step or the last two steps moving to our left, we started to get lower to lower our center of gravity and to create a wider stance so that when we changed directions, our foot was outside our knee and our knee was outside of our hip so that we had enough force to push into the ground, so push into the ground, to our left to push back to go right. And this is one reason why a low stance has more value in basketball. Because typically when you're in a stance and you're moving laterally in a defensive slide or defensive shuffle or whatever the terminology is that you'd like to use, you're expecting or you often have to make quick changes of direction. And so the low stance is valuable and important for these quick changes of direction. If you're too tall, you're likely going to be slower on the change of directions. However, if you are having to take 3, 4, 5, 6 shuffles in one direction, staying in a really low stance is not going to be the most advantageous position. So again, whether or not you should use a low stance depends on what you're using that low stance for. And so a lot of the instruction that I see, is, a common drill, and I did it as a player, is, players start in one baseline corner and they shuffle from, the baseline corner to the other baseline corner. Then you turn and run, get to half court, shuffle from, the sideline at half court to the other sideline at half court. Then go to the other baseline, do the same thing. So, roughly 40 feet of shuffling. And the instruction often is get in a low stance and stay low, and your head should stay level the entire time. But if the objective in that drill is to move quickly, telling players to get in a low stance to move in a shuffling movement pattern for 40 feet is incorrect. You're putting them in a suboptimal position to move fast. So again, what you're attempting to do, what the instructions are based on, what the purpose of the movement will help to dictate whether or not you should have a slightly taller stance or whether you should have a low stance. Low stance should not be used for all movements because if you are shuffling over distance, you want to be a little bit taller because that's where you're going to be able to get more maximum speed. If you're playing defense more in the half court and it's going to be a quick change of direction, then the low stance is probably going to be most advantageous for you.